Welcome to this Team Iron Cowboy special presentation. I'll be your host, Matt Fitzgerald here, Team Iron Cowboy coach and author of the book, How Bad Do You Want It? Mastering the Psychology of Mind Over Muscle. Today's webinar is all about developing mental fitness, a topic of special interest for me for a long time. And we're going to talk about 5 key coping skills for better endurance performance. Here's a quick overview of the presentation. We'll start off by talking about what limits endurance performance. Is it the body or is it the mind? What the science tells about that. Spoiler alert, the best and most recent science indicates quite convincingly that it is in fact the mind that is the most direct limiter of endurance performance. After we get through the science, we'll pivot to the practical side of the presentation and talk about 5 key coping skills that you can cultivate to improve as an endurance athlete. And those coping skills are passion, acceptance, focus, hunger, and belief. So here's the question: what is it that limits endurance performance? Is it the 2 general possibilities here? Is it the body or fitness? Why don't you run faster than you do in a race? What is your primary limiter that you encounter most directly? Is it your VO2 max or some other physiological limit that prevents you from going any faster than you do? Or is it a feeling, something in your mind, just the feeling of not being able to go any harder than you can? Let's see what science has to say about this question. One of the studies that I like to highlight when addressing this question, it was one that was done by some British researchers just a few years back. And if you've ever taken a VO2 max test, then you know something about an open loop fitness test. An open loop fitness test is a test where there is no predetermined finish. So in a traditional VO2 max test, you start off at a low intensity, and you either pedal or run while breathing into a gadget like the one you see in this photo that measures the amount of oxygen you're consuming. The reason for doing that is that one of the main physiological limiters of endurance performance is VO2 max or aerobic capacity, which is the maximum rate that your body is able to process oxygen during exercise. So in one of these tests, you start off at a low intensity. After a couple of minutes, you bump it up a notch, and then you keep doing that until you simply fail, until you can't go any longer. So the finish is not predetermined. You just go as long as you can, and that's why it's called an open loop test. Now, an open loop test is rather different from a race. Every race has a finish line that's predetermined, and that's known as a closed loop test. So these British researchers, their names were Mauger and Sculthorpe, they said, what if we change the traditional VO2 max format to make it a closed loop test, and then compare the results to see if this physiological limiter of aerobic capacity or VO2 max is the same in both. So they did that. They created a modified closed loop VO2 max test that had 5 steps, and the steps were determined by perceived effort. There's a commonly used scale of perceived effort. That's just that you give a numerical rating to your general sense of how hard you're working relative to your personal maximum capacity at any given moment. So in this 5-step closed loop VO2 max test, the subject started off at a low subjective rating of perceived effort. They got to decide their pace, but they chose a pace that put them at a particular perceived effort level. And then after 2 minutes, they were asked to increase their effort, adjust their pace to a higher perceived effort level. Step 5, the last 2-minute step of this closed loop VO2 max test, the subjects were instructed to simply go as hard as they could. So maximum perceived effort for the last part of the test. Separately, on a separate occasion, the same subjects did a traditional open loop VO2 max test. And lo and behold, what Mauger and Sculthorpe found was that VO2 max, the maximum rate at which these subjects were able to process oxygen during exercise was more than 8% higher in the closed loop test than it was in the open loop test. and also their peak power. So this was a cycling test, not a running VO2 max test. So their peak power was also significantly higher in the closed loop test. So what this shows us is that this classic test of a physiological limiter to endurance performance that was supposed to take subjects to a hard physical limit, their fitness limit, actually did not do that, because you tweak the test and find that actually subjects who go to the point of failure in an open loop VO2 max test actually have reserve capacity that they're not able to tap, and when they go by perceived effort, they're actually able to go a little bit harder. So what about closed loop tests? So if in an open loop test, like a traditional VO2 max test, it appears that subjects simply quit before they've actually tapped out their physiological capacity. What happens in a closed loop test? Do we achieve our ultimate physical limit in those types of tests, which again include races? The science there suggests no, that we don't reach our true physiological limits in closed loop tests any more than we do in open loop tests. We can go harder in a closed loop test, but not. We still have reserve capacity, and some of the evidence of that comes from the fact that if you do closed loop endurance tests of different types, if you just change the duration or have them done uphill versus flat, or in different modalities, cycling versus running, or what have you, or even do exactly the same test on two separate occasions, or do it at high altitude and low altitude on separate occasions, what you find is that scientists are unable to pinpoint a single physiological measurement that is always the same at the point of exhaustion in a closed loop test. So, for example, your blood lactate level. We know that high blood lactate levels tend to be associated with exhaustion in high intensity exercise, but there's no particular blood lactate level that always seems to cause exhaustion in any given athlete in every circumstance. Same thing with muscle glycogen depletion, muscle cell depolarization, which is sort of like the same way a battery runs out of juice. Your muscles run on electricity too, and they become depolarized. That's associated with fatigue, but again, there's no critical threshold that seems to directly cause fatigue. Core body temperature, same thing. The only measure that is always the same and maximal at the point of exhaustion in either an open loop or a closed loop fitness test is perceived effort, which is a psychological variable, not a physiological one. So it seems that perceived effort, that a subject's or an athlete's maximum tolerance for the feeling of effort, is what causes exhaustion, what directly limits performance. And it does that before physiological capacity has been completely tapped out. So the way that I like to try to explain this is the graph on the right here is drawn from a number of studies, but one in particular that was done fairly recently involving mountain bikers, actually. So the idea is that during the course of any race or time trial or similar fitness test, perceived effort increases linearly from start to end, and it reaches the maximal level. Whatever the maximum rating is on that scale, it's actually 20 on the traditional Borg scale of perceived exertion. So perceived effort starts low at the starting line, increases linearly, and then reaches maximum at the end. And this is so predictable that what you can actually do is, suppose you were standing beside a half-mile track watching some runners run around the track doing half-mile loops. And they're doing a race or a time trial or an all-out effort of a certain distance, but you don't know what the distance is. And the only information you're allowed to collect is each time a runner comes around and completes a loop, they give you a rating of perceived effort. So the first time around, they might say 8. Second time around, they might say 9.5 or what have you. Now, with that information alone, you can accurately predict how long that time trial or race is. Because once they've come around twice and you've got 2 data points, you can establish the slope of the increase in perceived effort, or the rate at which the rating of perceived effort is increasing. and you know what maximum is, whatever the scale is. It's usually 6 to 20, but it can be 1 to 10. Whatever the scale is, you just extend the slope of that line up to the point where it's going to reach maximum, and see what distance will have been covered, how many half-mile laps will have been covered when that point is reached, and you will know how far that those racers are racing. You don't need to have any information about pace or any physiological measurements at all, because perceived effort determines endurance athletes' limits in open and closed loop performance tests. So what is perception of effort exactly? I've defined it a little bit. The way one of the leading researchers in this area defines it is the conscious sensation of how hard, heavy, and strenuous the task is. We're all familiar with the concept of perceptions. They're just ways in which humans and other animals, other beings interact with the world, or perceive or sense the world through their various senses. And there are lots of them. Other perceptions that are clearly manifest during endurance exercise are pain. You will feel pain. You will feel fatigue. You will feel thirst, probably. Proprioception, which is your sense of where your limbs are in space, the movement of your limbs, the position of your various body parts. And then you have a perception of temperature as well. You could feel cold. You could feel hot. So there are all these various perceptions we have, but effort is not the same as any of them. Perception of effort is its own thing. It's not the same as pain. It's not the same as fatigue. There's a whole body of scientific proof that this is so, which I'm not going to get into. So take my word for it that perception of effort is a thing unto itself, and more than any other factor, pain, fatigue, thirst, all these other things, it is perception of effort that is the main limiter of endurance performance. So, it can be tough to understand this idea that it is, a feeling, perception of effort that limits endurance performance and not the body, because we all know that fitter people can race faster. So, am I saying that the body is irrelevant and that your fitness level has no influence at all? No, that's not the case. The body and fitness levels are very much relevant to endurance performance. We all know this. But the way they affect performance capacity is by constraining it, not by directly limiting it. So it's important to understand the difference between a constraint and a limiter. A constraint is really something that confines the space that you are able to operate within. A limiter is what determines exactly where you are able to go and not go within that broader space of possibilities. A good analogy that sort of drives home this difference is what I call the Italian restaurant analogy. So let's think about factors that might constrain the revenues that an Italian restaurant is able to bring in versus factors that actually directly limit the amount of revenue that the restaurant is able to bring in. So constraints, factors that sort of limit the broader space of possibilities for bringing in revenue for this type of business. One would be the number of locals who like Italian food. So if you own an Italian restaurant, you can't possibly hope to bring revenue from people who don't eat Italian food because they don't like it. But anyone in your locality who does like Italian food is a potential source of revenue. So that population of Italian food lovers represents a constraint. It's a constraint versus a limiter because you'll never get every single one of those people in the door, but you have a theoretical possibility to reach all of them. And also a different but similar constraint on your revenues will be the number of locals who can afford the food at your restaurant. Again, you're not going to get every single person in your locality who can afford to eat at your restaurant to actually do so, but theoretically you could. So that factor is another constraint, but it's not a direct limiter. The direct limiters on your revenues are factors that are sort of more narrow. One of those would be the number of tables in your restaurant, right? You have only so much capacity, only so many seats available. So even if you're able to pack them, that is an immovable limit. And another one is the average amount that is spent per party. That's going to be a hard direct limiter. There's only so much food people are going to eat at a meal. There's only so much you can charge for your menu items. So, the average amount spent per party is going to be a direct limiter on your performance. So you see the analogy here where in terms of endurance performance, physiology, what your body is capable of doing, factors like aerobic capacity, those are constraints on your performance as an endurance athlete. So you need to have sort of that biological machinery available to you. The faster you are, the more oxygen you can consume, the faster and longer you're going to be able to go in races. But you're not actually able to use all of that capacity, just like you're not able to get every Italian food lover into your Italian restaurant. What actually directly limits your performance before you ever get the opportunity to use all of your aerobic capacity or whatever is perception of effort. So you always reach the point where you just can't take any more suffering, as it were, before you reach the point where your body has nothing left to give. So it's interesting, what science is also showing is that this threshold where perception of effort becomes performance limiting, it kicks in around the 30-second mark. So if you do a race that lasts less than about 30 seconds, you actually can and do encounter your ultimate physiological limits, because even though you're aware of, you perceive effort in any type of race, even if it's a 5-second long race, you can handle just about any level of effort or suffering in a very, very short test of fitness. So in the 100-meter dash, for example, which takes about 10 seconds for elite males to complete, the limit in performance in that type of test is raw physiology. Athletes are perceiving a very high level of effort, but they just put up with it because they know it will be over with quickly. But when you extend the race longer and longer, from 10 seconds to 20 and so on, you get to a point where the perceived effort just keeps climbing and climbing to a point where there isn't a human alive that can stand any more perceived effort. Just like everyone has a limit for pain tolerance, everyone has a limit for perceived effort tolerance. So right around 30 seconds, anything longer than that, it's really perceived effort that becomes the limiter versus physiology. And this slide shows a couple of bits of proof that is the case. The first comes from a study in which subjects were asked to sit on stationary bikes and pedal as hard as they could for different durations, either 15 seconds or 30 seconds or 45 seconds. Regardless of the duration, they were told to pedal as hard as they could. But what ended up happening, is that in the longer tests, now you would expect wattage to decline, the amount of power that a person's able to put out. In a 45-second long all-out effort, you would expect people to lose power. But when they're told to pedal as hard as they can, you would expect the initial power to be the same regardless of the duration. You've been told to go all out. So whether it's 15 seconds, 30 seconds, 45 seconds, the wattage should be the same at the beginning and then decline as the effort is prolonged. But that's not what ended up happening in this experiment. What happened was, even though, despite what they've been told, the subjects largely unconsciously, or maybe even entirely unconsciously, held back a little bit initially in both the 30-second and especially the 45-second supposedly all-out effort. And what the scientists who conducted the study speculated was that based on past experience with high-intensity exertion, these subjects knew that they couldn't possibly stand the level of perceived effort they would experience if they truly went all out for 45 seconds. So they held back. They simply paced themselves probably without any conscious intent to do so. So we see this, sort of that 30-second threshold kind of at work in that study. And then another way to identify this threshold, this 30-second threshold beyond which perceived effort seems to become the primary limiter of performance, is by looking at average speed in world record performances at the full range of standard track and field race distances. So that's what you're looking at on the right-hand side with this table here. So obviously, in the shortest races, the average speed for a world record performance is the highest, and it tends to decline. But it doesn't decline if you double the distance. From 100 meters to 200, from 200 to 400. The rate of decline is not steady. As you see initially, between 100 meters and 200 meters, there's no difference in speed. It's almost exactly the same for Usain Bolt's world record performances at those two differences. Then from 200 to 400 meters, there's a fairly significant difference. So the world record pace for 400 meters is 11% slower than it is for 200 meters. Now, if you fast forward to some of the longer race distances, you see that the differences become even shallower. So, the 5K, we'll say the mile, which is, twice as long, slightly more than twice as long as 800 meters, the difference is 7%. From the mile to 5K, that's a difference of threefold actually in distance. The difference is only 8.4%, and then it gets even shallower from there. Between 10K and the half marathon, it's 4.9%. Between the marathon and half marathon and marathon, it's 4.9%. But the big drop where athletes seem to just kind of fall off a cliff is, you see where I put the red highlighting, between 400 and 800 meters. So again, you're just doubling the distance, but suddenly the difference in speed is 14.3%. So, physiology can't really account for that. It can to a small degree. You have, different causes of fatigue at different speeds and over different distances. But that appears to be the point at which, 400 meters, the world record is 43 seconds. 800 meters, it's 1 minute and 40 seconds. So when you get out beyond, you're getting well beyond that 30-second threshold. And so that seems to be the point where, an all-out effort of a certain distance, athletes just cannot tolerate the level of perceived effort they would experience if they used their full physiological capacity in completing that distance. So that's kind of real-world evidence that there's this switch where we're always aware of perceived effort, even in the shortest races. But only after a certain distance does it become intolerable, and we're forced to maintain some reserve capacity. Now, I should note, one of the objections I get, especially from elite athletes, when I make this point, is they'll insist that at the end of a race of any distance, they will feel completely exhausted. They will feel as if they've given out absolutely everything they have to give. But that's only because of the so-called finishing kick. Now think about it. At the end of any race, no matter how long the race is, eventually you're going to be within 30 seconds of the finish line. And once you're within 30 seconds of the finish line of a race, it doesn't matter anymore. Psychologically, you kick back into that mentality of, well, I can handle any amount of suffering for less than 30 seconds. So that's why you have the common end spurt phenomenon, which is really even further evidence that athletes are holding back more than they strictly have to for physical reasons, purely biological reasons in races. So, even at the highest level of competition, you'll see people get to the last lap of a race, or within 30 seconds of the finish line, and suddenly there's a kick. There's an increase in effort. Obviously, that couldn't happen if athletes were already at their limit at that point. But the reason for the finishing kick or the end spurt is purely psychological. The reserve capacity is there. You get to the point where you're close enough to the finish line where you say, what the heck, I can handle anything for 30 seconds or less. So that's why athletes, feel as if they've given everything, because in fact, in the last 30 seconds of a race, a highly motivated athlete can in fact give everything. But if you take the race as a whole, it is perceived effort that determines the athlete's average pace over the course of that full distance. They're racing by feel, and it's perceived effort that is the reason that the athlete finishes in a certain amount of time and no faster. So there's a name for this. All this new science is part of a new movement, a new model of endurance performance called the psychobiological model of endurance performance. And over here on the left-hand side, there's just a kind of a quick summary of the thesis of this new model, which is based on this new science of perception of effort. I'll just read it for you. In the light of the psychobiological model, the point of exhaustion during exercise is a form of task disengagement in which individuals will exercise until A, the perception of effort rises to the critical level set by the potential motivation, or B, believed to be physically unable to maintain the task. Translation, exhaustion is a form of quitting. That's basically all that verbiage is saying there. That's what task disengagement is. It's a choice. If you bonk in a race, you're actually choosing to slow down, even though it doesn't feel like that. You have a little bit of reserve capacity. So obviously, this is a discovery that has important implications for how we approach our sport, how we interpret the task of trying to improve as endurance athletes, and that's what I'm about to get into. Another helpful analogy that I like to use is the horse and jockey analogy. So in this analogy, the jockey is your mind and the horse is your body. So the horse represents your physical fitness, your physical capacity, and the jockey is your mental resources. So they have very different roles, horse and jockey, mind and body. So the horse or the body, what makes it unique, what its contribution is that it doesn't feel anything, but it gets tired. So perceived effort comes from your mind. It doesn't come from your body. So, when you're racing, the reason you feel effort is because of how hard your mind is working to crack the whip on your body, or the horse, as it were. So, your body, it does not contribute directly to the feeling of perceived effort. It just does the work that your mind demands that it do. And it's your mind, in fact, the jockey, that feels the effort. So it's cracking the whip, not running itself, that causes you to feel perceived effort and causes you to eventually reach a point where you can't stand any more effort. But your brain, although it does feel perceived effort, it actually doesn't get tired, not in the way your body does. So there are different contributions between horse and jockey here, mind and body. And what's critical to understand is that in terms of what is actually limiting you, your brain, the jockey, always gets to the point where it feels too much effort to bear before the horse or body gets tired. So your body does get tired. It can get tired. It conceivably can fail, but it never actually does, because the jockey simply gets from the feeling of effort that comes from cracking the whip. It reaches a limit in terms of how much of that feeling is bearable before the horse actually runs out of energy. So, apologize for the image there, but thought it was amusing. So the idea is, what you want to do as an athlete is become a better jockey. So that's really that's what mental fitness is in endurance sports. If we go back to that horse and jockey analogy, is that you want to become a better jockey. Of course, you want a better horse too, and that's really what physical training does. If you increase your physical capacity, if you build a better horse through training, then the jockey doesn't have to crack the whip as hard to get a certain amount of performance out of the horse. I'm torturing this metaphor, I know. So it's easier it doesn't take as much mental effort to drive a fitter body to perform. So that's important as well. But in terms of the mental side of fitness, there are really two ways to become more mentally fit, to become a stronger jockey. One is to reduce the amount of perceived effort that you feel at any given level of output. I just suggested that increasing fitness does that very thing. But there are other ways, and we're going to talk about a couple of them. So the idea here is that basically you find ways through strengthening your mind to make an 8-minute mile feel easier than it used to. Because if an 8-minute mile feels easier than it used to, you'll be able to run more 8-minute miles. and you'll also be able to, it'll be more likely that you'll be able to sustain a 7-minute mile over some race distance, even if you're not physically fitter. If a certain pace starts to feel easier, you will be able to perform better in competition, because again, perceived effort is the true limiter. And then the second way to build a better jockey is to increase maximum perceived effort tolerance. So everyone has a limit to how much perceived effort they can tolerate, but if you can increase that limit, you can perform better in competition and training. Even again, aside from even if your physical fitness level remains the same, if you increase that maximum tolerance for perceived effort, you will be able to perform better. So let's talk about 5 coping skills for better endurance performance. Coping skills is a term just from basic psychology, and it's any mental attribute that people use to sort of get by in the world, to achieve goals. So coping skills are just as important to endurance performance as they are to relationships, the workplace, dealing with setbacks in life. Coping skills are just psychological tools that we have in order to literally cope in life, and they have just as much relevant to the race course as they do to other facets of life. So the first coping skill I want to talk about is passion. What is passion? The psychologist Robert Vallerand defines it as a strong inclination toward a self-defining activity that people like or even love, find important, and in which they invest time and energy on a regular basis. So, to be passionate about endurance sports is just to love your sport. And of course, there can be a whole range. You can like your sport, you can like it a lot, you can love it a little, you can love it a lot. But the idea is that the more passionate you are, the better. Why is that? How does passion enhance endurance performance? Science shows us. So the guy on the treadmill there on the left, he comes from, or he's meant to symbolize the results of a study done by Swedish researchers, where they took a bunch of runners and had them run at different perceived effort levels on a treadmill and outside. So if on the 6 to 20 Borg scale, for example, I think it was 3 different levels of perceived effort. They asked them to run at 9, 11, and 13. And then they looked at what pace they actually chose. So, a certain runner at, a perceived effort level of 13, which is just above the lactate threshold if you're interested, might be running at, 7 minutes per mile. And then so that they had them do exactly the same thing outside, run at 3 different perceived effort levels, 9, 11, and 13, and they measured their pace outdoors. What they found was that the runners ran significantly faster at the same perceived effort level outside versus inside. What's interesting about that is that, as most people know, heart rate is lower at any given pace on a treadmill than it is outside. So even though, by one measure, running on a treadmill is easier than running outside, performance capacity is actually greater outside. And the reason is running outside at any given pace feels easier than running at the same pace inside. And the reason it feels easier, this is what scientists have conjectured, is that it's simply more enjoyable. There's a reason that the treadmill has been nicknamed the dreadmill. It's just not as pleasant to run on a treadmill as it is outside. So the relative pleasantness of running outside reduces perceived effort relative to output and allows us to perform at a higher capacity. So it's just a little bit of evidence that passion, or simply enjoying your activity more, will help you perform better in that activity. Another study that sort of makes the same point is on the right-hand side here. It was done by Alan St. Clair Gibson in 2012. And what they did is they had cyclists come into the lab and do a time trial on stationary bikes on 2 separate occasions. And it was exactly the same time trial. There were no differences. Almost any endurance athlete is aware that if you do exactly the same race or time trial twice, a week or 10 days apart, it's very unlikely that you'll have exactly the same time, exactly the same performance. They'll be at least a few seconds different. And what these scientists wanted to try to understand is why. what accounts for these small differences. So, your fitness level is the same, everything is the same, but you don't perform exactly the same anytime you repeat exactly the same test. So what accounts for that? So these scientists had the athletes do the same test twice, and they measured absolutely everything they could measure, looking for whatever accounted for the difference physiologically or psychologically. And what they found was that the only difference was, in fact, psychological, not physiological. So physiological measurements, heart rate and all that stuff, oxygen consumption, were pretty much exactly the same in the two different time trials. I should state that, in fact, all of the subjects performed slightly differently in either the first, either slightly faster in the first test than the second, or slightly faster in the second test compared to the first. But there was always a difference. And the difference was not physiological. The difference was that there was a tendency for athletes to have higher levels of positive affect in the time trial in which they perform better. And positive affect is just as it sounds. It's just feeling better about the workout. So there's a chicken and egg thing there, where they're feeling better because they were performing better, or vice versa. It seems to be at least partly vice versa, that they performed better because they were feeling better, that they just were, for whatever reason, maybe they just woke up on the right side of the bed that day, but they were feeling more into their workout because they were more passionate about performing. They were enjoying it more. That allowed them to release more of their physical capacity into the workout and perform better. So this is, scientifically, this is why enjoyment matters. This is how passion, enhancing your passion for your sport, matters from just a hardcore performance perspective. So how can you enhance or maintain your passion for endurance sports? Here's just a laundry list of measures that could help you out. One is to set goals that excite you. Athletes all the time ask me, what should my next goal be? I always tell them, you tell me. The whole purpose of a goal is to just stimulate excitement for getting out of bed and doing the next workout and the one after that. So goals should come from you. They should come from within. Any goal that just stokes your passion for your sport is a good goal. Another thing is to do your sport your way. So there's more than one way to skin a cat in terms of training. There's any given athlete can train in more than one. Obviously, there are right and wrong ways to train. But within the sort of the confines of the right ways to train, the best way to train is the way that is most fun for you. So if you like to train alone, train alone. If you like to train with music, train with music. If you like a certain kind of workout more than another, don't go too far with that, because we tend to avoid the workouts that strengthen our weaknesses. But there's a lot of room to do your sport your way, and if you take advantage of that, you will enjoy your sport more and get more out of your training. Elite level athletes are really good at this. It's interesting. If you kind of look at their training logs and just look at their training habits, they're not all doing the same thing. But what they all tend to do is trust their instincts for preferring certain methods over others. Again, some methods just don't work, but there's more than one way to skin a cat, and you should listen to the feedback that you get from your own mind in response to training. If you like certain things more, do more of them. Obviously, we know that from the cliche, variety is the spice of life. So adding variety to your training and racing is another great way to enhance passion. Mix things up, try new things. That tends to work very well. And then another thing, often overlooked way to maintain passion for your sport is to actually not be too obsessed about it, but to maintain a healthy sport and life balance. Sometimes the best way to reinvigorate your passion for your sport is to get away from it for a little while, to have an off season, to take a vacation, to just chill. The happier you are in your life, the better you will be as an athlete. So pay attention to your life outside of sports as well. Coping skill number 2 is acceptance. What is acceptance? Acceptance is embracing discomfort as an unavoidable part of the endurance sports experience. So it's basically, acceptance is the opposite of denial or resistance. We all know that endurance sports are they are uncomfortable, especially in racing. Can be downright unpleasant. But learning to accept that dimension of the sport is performance enhancing, whereas resisting it, rejecting it, or even denying it has the opposite effect. It's bad for performance. So how does this work? How does acceptance enhance endurance performance? So the image there on your left is from, that's called a cold pressor test. So that's a classic scientific test of pain tolerance. And what researchers have found when they do this, and basically what they do is they ask you to stick your hand in freezing water and hold it there as long as you can. And they time it, and the longer you can keep it in there, the higher your pain tolerance is. And what they found is that people tend to have a higher pain tolerance. They can keep their hand in the cold water longer if before the test begins, they consciously accept that the test is going to hurt, and they just submit to that reality. Whereas people tend to have a lower pain tolerance. They take their hand out sooner if they go into the test kind of in a state of denial, or this sort of they maintain this illusion of hoping it won't hurt as bad as they really, in fact, know it will. So these attitudes, these psychological postures for approaching an unpleasant experience, they matter. They don't have any effect on how much pain you actually feel. They only affect how much pain you're able to tolerate. Now, pain is different from perceived effort. They're both perceptions, but they're not. They're distinct perceptions. And yet, what research tends to show is most things that are true for pain tend to be true for perceived effort as well. And that is very much true in this case. Over on the right-hand side here, there's a reference to a study done by Elena Ivanova in 2014, where she took a group of women who are non-athletes, and she subjected them to a high-intensity endurance test. So I think it was they had to pedal stationary bikes at 80% of VO2 max until they quit. And they did this test twice. Between the first test and the second test, half of the subjects were subjected to something called acceptance and commitment therapy. Acceptance and commitment therapy just basically trains people to learn to become more accepting of unavoidable, unpleasant experiences. And it's usually not done in an athletic context, but it certainly can be, and it was for the purposes of this experiment. And the women who had this training in acceptance, when they repeated the test of high-intensity endurance test, they lasted 55% longer than they did the first time. Now, these people weren't exercising. The difference had nothing to do with becoming fitter. It was just simply that they had a more accepting attitude of the fact that the test was going to suck. Whereas the controls, the women who didn't have this therapy, they did not improve their performance at all. So how do you cultivate acceptance? How do you sort of develop a better attitude toward the inevitability of suffering in your sport? Here's 3 ways. One is what I call naming your fears. So sometimes, actually, I'm an example of this. I used to be kind of a head case. I used to sort of finish races feeling as if I hadn't given it my all, simply because I feared the discomfort. And the way I worked on that, the first step I took was to make becoming mental tougher my conscious goal. So I named my fear. I just admitted to myself, you know what, Matt, you are mentally weak and you need to become mentally stronger. So simply doing that, just acknowledging that I had this problem, really opened the door for me to begin to address it. And it works really well, for all kinds of fears you may have. Instead of just sort of pretending that fear doesn't exist or wishing it away, go ahead and acknowledge it. And that's the first step toward becoming more accepting of whatever the source of discomfort may be, in this case, perceived effort. Bracing yourself is another helpful tool. So before you do any race, you should basically tell yourself, this race is going to be very hard. And in fact, it may be as hard as any race I've ever done. Just accept that might be the case. What research has shown is that there are really 2 layers to perceived effort. The first layer is how you feel. And you can't do anything about how you feel. That's just sort of, that's raw physiology. Although it's brain physiology, It's just there. So if you get 5K into a 10K race, you're going to feel a certain way based on your fitness, your fatigue level, how your body, the state of readiness of your body, how you've paced yourself, how you feel is just how you feel. You can't do anything about it. But there's a second layer, which is how you feel about how you feel. So, regardless of how you feel at 5K in a 10K race, you can either have a good attitude or a bad attitude about that feeling. You can either embrace it or just sort of shrink from it. And embracing it will help you perform better. And one way to help yourself embrace it is to brace yourself beforehand, because any difference between how you expect to feel halfway through a race and how you actually do feel will either help or hurt your performance. If at any point in a race you feel worse than you expected to, you're likely to develop a worse attitude about how you feel and slow down and not perform as well. So one way to avoid that is just to consciously say, consciously prepare yourself for any level of suck during the race so that you'll never be unpleasantly surprised. So no matter how bad you feel, you knew going in that you might feel that bad, and you won't sort of have this panic response to it. So that's what bracing yourself is. The quote on the right-hand side is from the great British distance runner Mo Farah. That's from a newspaper interview he did before he ran his first marathon. This is going to be the hardest race of my life, he said. It sounds like pessimism on the surface, but it's not at all. Pessimism would be, I'm going to fail to achieve my goal, or I'm going to have a lousy race. That's not what he was saying. He believed he could achieve his goal. He believed he was going to have a good race, but he was smart enough, wise enough to brace himself and say to himself, I will only achieve my goal by pushing through a really hard race. So he was preparing himself psychologically for a hard effort. And he almost certainly performed better as a result of that. And a third way to cultivate acceptance is to choose your discomfort. So when you get to the point of a race, when you just start to feel lousy, and if you're working hard enough, you should get to that point. You should sort of just kind of you have an option there. These experiences that we have are nuanced as athletes, and they're complex, and you can come at them, you can interpret them in a variety of ways. And what you want to do when you get to those moments is just recognize that you're feeling uncomfortable, and just choose to continue feeling that way. Choose to continue to maintain the effort that is causing you to feel that discomfort, because there's no way around it. You can't have the level of performance you're seeking without the discomfort that comes along with it. So you have a choice there. And although choosing your discomfort doesn't make the discomfort any less, it does make you feel better about it, because suddenly you're in control of it. It's like, yeah, I'm feeling lousy, but I'm choosing this because it's a means to a greater end, which is the goal I'm trying to achieve. So these are 3 ways to cultivate an attitude of acceptance, that particular coping skill. Coping skill number 3, focus. What is focus? Focus is the ability to keep your attention locked on relevant/useful stimuli and to tune out distracting and unhelpful stimuli, such as grizzly bear chasing you down. So how does focus enhance endurance performance? In psychological terms, focus, they tend not to use the term focus. They have a few others, one of which is inhibitory control. And that's a mouthful, but it's a simple concept. Let me explain what inhibitory control is. So anytime you want 2 different things simultaneously that are incompatible, inhibitory control is the mental skill that allows you to choose which of those incompatible things is most important to you, and to stay focused on that, and to tune out the one that you've decided to live without. So the example I always like to give is, you have a goal of losing 10 pounds, and then you're presented with a slice of German chocolate cake, your favorite dessert. And so you can't have both. You want both. You love the dessert, but you really want to lose 10 pounds. So if you want to lose 10 pounds more than you want that slice of German chocolate cake, you have to sort of mentally focus on that goal of losing 10 pounds and tune out the temptation of the slice of German chocolate cake. Now, it's pretty easy to recognize how inhibitory control comes into play in endurance sports. because anytime you're pushing yourself through a high level of perceived effort, you're going to want two incompatible things at once. One thing you're going to want is to keep pushing toward your goal. The other thing you're going to want is to end your suffering. And obviously the easiest way to do that is just to slow down or stop. So you can't slow down or stop and keep pressing toward your goal. So you have to choose one. You have to use focus or inhibitory control to decide which one is more important to you and to keep your attention locked on that. Now, fascinatingly, there was a study done just last year by Italian researchers in which they tested the effect of inhibitory control or focus on endurance performance. And so there were some standard computer tests of inhibitory control. The graphic on the left comes from one of those tests. So it's important to understand these tests of inhibitory control or focus are done at rest in street clothes in front of a computer. They have nothing to do with aerobic capacity or anything that's relevant to endurance physiology at all. It is entirely a mental skill. But in this study, a group of ultramarathon runners were subjected to a test of inhibitory control. And as with anything else, some scored very well, some others not so well. So there was a whole range of performance for focus or inhibitory control. And then the same runners went out and ran an 80-kilometer ultramarathon. And amazingly, what the researchers found is that performance in this purely mental test of inhibitory control predicted performance in the ultramarathon. So the athletes who scored highest for inhibitory control or focused tended to finish higher up, finish faster in the ultramarathon. And those with less focus, less inhibitory control, tended to finish toward the back of the pack. So it's a purely mental skill that obviously has a great impact on endurance performance. So how do you improve your focus? Item number one on the list I've got for you here is to keep training. Anything that tests, anything that puts you in a situation where you have to make this kind of choice will improve your inhibitory control. And as I just finished saying, exercise does that. Endurance exercise does that. So it's actually a well-proven fact that aerobic exercise training enhances inhibitory control. So this is why this new model of endurance sports is called the psychobiological model, because it really mashes mind and body together and shows how you can't really truly separate them. They're interpenetrating. So just simply by increasing your physical fitness through training, you will also increase your inhibitory control, because anytime you work out, your brain goes along for the ride. And by day after day exposing your brain to circumstances where it has to choose to keep going instead of slowing down or quitting, you become stronger and stronger in that coping skill of focus. So you can also practice inhibitory control in everyday life. So you can develop this skill outside of training and strengthen it so that it helps you once you're back on the training grounds or the race course. And you can do this in a million different ways. Just one example is with your diet. So if you're trying to improve your diet and you want to improve your focus or inhibitory control at the same time, you can start with small challenges. Just pick something that is a food temptation for you, a particular food that you should eat less of, but that you are often tempted by, or something that you tend to keep in the home. And you eat it when it's there, but you're less likely to eat it if it's not. Find something that you want to master. Let's just go back to the German chocolate cake. So you decide to cut down on your German chocolate cake consumption by choosing and attacking that goal. Just a small, manageable one. If you succeed in that, you will gain inhibitory control, and then there are stepping stones. You can sort of go to the next challenge from there, and through this process enhance your capacity to focus on what matters most, to tune out what doesn't, and that will help you again once you're back on the training grounds or the race course. That enhanced capacity will help you perform better as an athlete. And then another way to improve your focus is to consciously learn to steer or direct your attention. So when you're out there training or racing, you can choose to focus your attention in any direction you want. And some ways of focusing your attention are better than others. So the idea there is that you want to learn to direct your attention toward sensations, thoughts, images that are helpful to you or are relevant to performing your task, and learn to ignore thoughts, images, sensations, etc. that are irrelevant or tend to harm performance. So it's just a process of just becoming, it's a form of mindfulness, really. So, for example, just to make this concrete, focusing on the athlete ahead of you in a race, and sort of putting a target on their back and trying to catch that athlete if you can. That is a way of steering or directing your attention, of using the capacity to focus that could help you perform better. Whereas getting distracted by thoughts of insecurity or lack of self-confidence, most of us are prone to have some of those moments in races. Here we go again. I'm going to fail, or I can feel myself getting weaker. Those thoughts are not helpful. And so you want to kind of learn to catch those early and steer your attention away from them. And if you do that often enough, it'll get easier, and you'll just become all around better able to direct your attention to focus in performance enhancing ways. Coping skill number 4 is hunger. What is hunger? By hunger, I really mean motivation, which is the desire or willingness to do something, to invest effort into something. There's an image of the cover of my book there, which is that expression there, how bad do you want it, is all about hunger and motivation. So how does hunger enhance endurance performance? How does motivation enhance endurance performance? There's all kinds of proof that the more motivated an athlete is for any kind of test, the better they will be able to perform in that test. And what motivation does in particular is that it increases your maximum perceived effort tolerance. So you're just simply willing and able to suffer more when you're more motivated. It's really just as simple as that. And the text here on the right-hand side of the screen is from one particular study. I could have chosen any of a number of others that drive home this point. This one's an interesting one. So what the researcher did is he recruited a bunch of club level runners. I think it was a couple hundred of them as subjects, and he interviewed them about their personal rivals. So a lot of these runners had fellow club members or new runners from other clubs, or just new runners that they often saw in local races that they considered rivals. And then the researcher, he poured through the results of hundreds of races that these subjects, these club runners, had participated in, and he compared performances in races where rivals were present versus races of the same distance in which rivals were not present. And these races ranged from, I think, 5 kilometers up to half marathon in distance. And what he found is that on average, the runners that were the subjects of this study tended to race 5 seconds per kilometer faster in races in which there was a rival present. So the implication is that when a rival was present, these runners were more motivated to perform, and when they were more motivated, they were willing to suffer more. Their perceived effort tolerance increased, and that's what allowed them to race faster. So just a little bit of proof that motivation is performance enhancing. How do you increase your motivation? James Lawrence, the Iron Cowboy, he talks about connecting with your why, or finding your why. Our sports matter to us for personal reasons, and they're not the same reasons for all of us. There's some reason that you decided to become an athlete, and there's some reason, maybe more than one, that you're willing to put a lot of effort and time into your training, that you are willing to suffer in races. And being in touch, staying in touch with that why, with that personal motivation or set of motivations, is a great source of motivation itself and the performance that comes with it. And great athletes, high performing athletes are really good at that. So they know why their sport matters to them and why it's worth putting in their very best effort. And in those tough moments of races, they will draw upon that why as a source of the courage they need to keep pushing. And I encourage you to do the same. Another way to increase motivation is to set what I call 50-50 goals. 50-50 goals are goals that are just at the outer limits of what are realistic for you. So they're goals that you can achieve, but that you might not, even if you do everything right in your training and you have a good day. And the reason you want to set goals that you may or may not actually be able to achieve is that I'm not going to do this, but if you go way back to the slide where I defined the psychobiological models kind of thesis of endurance performance, they mentioned there that quitting tends to occur in either of two circumstances. One, when an athlete reaches their maximum tolerance for perceived effort, or two, when their goal falls out of reach. Think about it. If you're working hard in a race and you have a certain goal, and you get to the point where you sort of check your watch and you see, it's not going to happen today. Often, what will happen in those circumstances is that there'll be a letdown, and you'll kind of pack it in a little bit. Even if it could be just a 2%, loss of momentum, but that's what tends to happen. And athletes will never put in a greater effort when they check their watch and they find that their goal is still within reach, but barely within reach. When a goal is still out there, it's still possible, but it requires that you give a little bit more. That is the thing that allows you to give a little bit more. Many of us have had that experience in a race. You get to the last mile mark and you see, oh man, I can still do it, but I'm going to have to lay it all out. Nothing will motivate you to lay it all out than that kind of setup. And you can sort of manipulate that bit of psychology by setting goals in the right way. Your goals just should not be easy. If you achieve your goal every time in every race, you're not setting the right kind of goals. The same is true if you never achieve your goals. They have to be realistic, but again, they should be at the outer limits for what is realistically possible for you. And then finally, so exploiting the group effect is another way to increase motivation. So, human beings are social animals, and you can take advantage of that to increase your motivation and perform better. There's plenty of research showing that when people train in groups and compete in groups, they perform better. Part of that is competitive, but another part is cooperative. It's actually it's been suggested that when people train and race together, their brains produce more endorphins, the runner's high chemical. So that's a factor that causes any given level of exercise output to feel easier. And when it feels easier, you can perform better. There's a photo here of Kenyan runners who are notorious for training in large groups in their homeland, and that's believed to be one of the reasons that they're so dominant in the sport of distance running, is that they really take advantage of the group effect. You can also take advantage of the group effect just by being observed. So there's research showing that you can bench press more if someone's watching you than if nobody's watching you, and so you can take advantage of that by choosing races with great spectator support. You'll tend to perform better in those races where I'm about to run the Boston Marathon, which is the ultimate for the group effect. You can also have your own little fan base, get the family out there to cheer for you, or even use social media to kind of cultivate a fan base and get people observing you virtually as an athlete, so you'll perform better. Coping skill number 5, this is the last one, belief. What is belief? Belief is an expectation of positive outcomes. Now, how does belief enhance endurance performance? Basically, when you expect positive outcomes are more likely to occur. It's as simple as that. And there's plenty of research demonstrating that is in fact the case. I give one example here on the left-hand side of the slide. Comes from a study done in 2013. And what the researchers there did is they took a bunch of runners and they gave them a performance-enhancing supplement to drink before they ran a 5K. Except the performance-enhancing supplement was just a sham. It wasn't anything special at all, but they were told it was special. So some of the runners got this placebo, or I guess all of the runners they got it, and they ran a 5K, and then they ran a separate 5K without getting the performance enhancing supplement that wasn't really performance enhancing. But in fact, they ran faster when they got the supplement, even though that wasn't the reason. What the actual reason was their expectation that they would perform better after drinking that supplement. So obviously, the upshot here, the point of this is not that we should all fool ourselves and go after all kinds of magical potions and try to trick ourselves into performing better. It's just I'm driving home the point that expecting better outcomes tends to yield better outcomes. And it does this, again, everything's mediated through perception of effort. So, if you have some reason, and it doesn't really matter what the reason is, to expect that you will perform better, you will tend to have a lower level of perceived effort at familiar levels of work output. And again, that's the very thing that allows you to do a little bit more than you could under other circumstances. And on the right-hand side of the screen, I've got a quote that I like very much from the basketball coach, Billy Donovan. Believe in your system and then sell it to your players. So in terms of things that you actually would want to use to increase expectations for better performance, your system, your training system, that the total methodology and some of the specific practices that you use to prepare for success as an athlete. Obviously, all of those things should help you in purely physical ways. They help you get fitter. They help you get leaner. Maybe they help you stay injury free. But these things can also help you perform better on a purely psychological level, just because you believe in them. So how are some ways to nurture belief, the expectation of positive outcomes? One is to train yourself in positive self-talk. There was a study done recently by Sam Weller-Marcora, the guy who actually wrote the foreword to my book, How Bad Do You Want It?, who's really the father of the psychobiological model of endurance performance. And he did a study in which he trained a group of subjects in positive self-talk. And that's simply, it's the little engine that could, right? I think I can. So you will tend to perform better as an athlete if when you have negative thoughts during a race, you learn to replace those negative thoughts with positive alternatives. So if your thought is I'm feeling lousy, or my goal is falling out of reach, you catch that thought before it can kind of infect your brain and replace it with a positive alternative. An example, one that I often use in competition is, I've been here before. I'll remind myself, I felt just as lousy as this in past races, and those races turned out okay. So it ain't over yet. That's an example of positive self-talk, and it is proven to be performance enhancing because you're actually sort of taking control of your mind to improve expectations for better outcomes. Another way to nurture belief is to become an expert on your sport. I mentioned the importance of sort of believing in your system. Well, first you need to have a system and understand your system in order to have something you actually believe in. You can't just manufacture belief. So educating yourself about your sport, becoming a coach of sorts. The gentleman whose photograph you see on the left there is the legendary New Zealand running coach, Arthur Lydiard, who, I think, he's acknowledged as maybe the greatest coach of all time. And the thing, even more than X's and O's and just, knowing the sport that made him a great coach, is that he instilled belief in his athletes. He had a certain system, and he really got his athletes to drink the Kool-Aid, to believe that that Arthur Lydiard's system was infallible, that if you trained his way, you couldn't lose, you couldn't fail. So yeah, it was a good system, but his athletes' belief in his system was just as important as the training methods themselves. So to get to the point where you can be your own Arthur Lydiard, you need to kind of study your sport, become a kind of a coach to yourself of sorts, so that you really you're invested in what you're doing. You see what the possibilities are. You choose what you believe is best, and that belief will help you perform better. And then lastly, seeking out mentors. So find your Arthur Lydiard. And there's a reason that even the greatest professional endurance athletes have coaches. It's because it's really helpful to just find mentors, role models, experts out there who just inspire a lot of faith and trust. You can sort of put some of the burden of confidence onto them that they can carry for you, and that helps a lot. If you some of us we struggle with confidence, we struggle with insecurity, but if you can find someone who believes in you and someone you believe in, to act, it could even be a training partner or a friend or a spouse, what have you. But someone who just builds you up, and by being around that person, they sort of boost your expectations for how you're going to perform as an athlete. That'll be self-fulfilling. All right, so yes, I say here that I will take questions. This is not a live webinar, so I can't take questions right here, but I certainly can take them through the Team Iron Cowboy forums, and I'm also reachable through my website, mattfitzgerald.org. Hope you got something out of this. I certainly enjoyed offering you this material, and use it.